At a controversial and troubling issue facing the Catholic Church, the Vatican setting new rules for who will serve as judge and jury when it comes to abuse allegations against priests. Priests accused of sexual abuse against children have always been tried in secret ecclesiastical courts, but now the Vatican will oversee the cases directly from Rome. The courts will be made up of a panel of priests, and alleged victims must bring charges within 10 years. The church trials do not preclude civil or criminal prosecution. The Vatican says the rules are intended to protect the rights of the accused. But critics say they make it appear the Roman Catholic Church is trying to hide abuses. Phil Saviano made national headlines in 1993 when he and other victims won a case against Father David Holly. Holly was found guilty of sexual abuse and sentenced to 275 years in prison. Now, Mr. Saviano is the Northeast Director of SNAP, Survivors Network for Those Abused by Priests. He joins us in Boston. Mr. Saviano, thanks for being here today.
Good afternoon, Lester.
What, in your view, have these abuse cases cost the Catholic Church, not in money, but in non-economic terms?
Well, they've lost a lot of their reputation with the faithful followers that they've had all these years. You know, when you have a church that just in the United States is paying out nearly $1 billion over a period of 12 or 15 years, that's a sign of a significant problem.
I'd like to get your view on these secret Vatican tribunals. Does that help move this along? Does it help to get the Catholic Church to recognize the problem more?
Well, I think the operative word here is secret, and that's been the problem all along. Sexual abuse has always thrived in an atmosphere of secrecy, and it's very disappointing to me at this point in the game to hear the Vatican come out with a policy that calls for more secrecy. They neglect to mention in this policy that sex abuse is a crime, and there are laws that require it to be treated as such. All of these things should be reported to police. They should be investigated by police, and the results of the investigation should be made public. What
about the statute of limitations that would be part of this? How long from the time you were abused until this case ended?
Well, in my experience, I was abused when I was 11 and 12 years old before I went through puberty, but it took me until I was 40 that I had the courage and the knowledge to come forward and figure it's time to get the story out there. And in my work with SNAP and hearing from survivors all across the country, generally, because of the emotional damage, the ramifications that happen to a kid when someone they see as God's representative on earth sexually assaults them, it takes them at least until they're in their 30s when they feel comfortable to come forward.
Have you seen, particularly there in Boston, more of a willingness, the Archdiocese, to come forward and confront this head on?
The diocese willingness? They have been more active in recent years, but it's only because victims and the news media are holding their feet to the fire. We think of it as helping the Cardinal do a better job.
What about on the preventive side? Is the Church doing enough to stop these abuses from occurring?
Well, they're doing more, but one of the problems that they have is that historically the Catholic Church has been a great hiding place for men who have a sexual attraction to children. And unfortunately, once a priest, always a priest. So it's up to them to be constantly vigilant and constantly looking for ways to ensure that children are protected.
And we should point out, and I think we did, that a lot of these rules of these tribunals still haven't been laid out, but there is a question of whether they will feel compelled to tell civil authorities about what they discovered. Would you like that to be laid out a little more concretely?
Well, absolutely. Sure, it should be laid out as one of the main provisions. The other thing is, you know, the key elements of any good sexual abuse policy call for healing of the victim and preventing this from happening in the first place. And neither of those elements are addressed in this policy either. So I think it could use a little bit of work.
You were a victim. Talk about your healing process.
Well, I have found over the years that one of the best things is to come out with the story, talk about it with other victims, and engage in some sort of activity where you feel like you're making a difference in helping to protect future kids from experiencing the sort of thing that I had to go through when I was a kid. And again, you know, the key elements are talking about it and getting it out there, not keeping it bottled up, not keeping it secret.
And you talk to young victims?
I don't generally hear from victims till they're at least in their late 20s or early 30s. But I talk to a lot of victims, yes, both men and women.
And what usually prompts people ultimately to confront or to talk about it, to deal with it publicly?
Well, it can be a variety of things. For example, if a priest has been a priest for many years and they hear that, he's still assigned to a parish somewhere, someone else comes forward with an allegation of abuse, that can finally sort of turn the tide and convince that victim that he needs to come forward as well. That is sort of what happened with me in my case. I knew Hawley in the 1960s, but he molested kids in the 1970s out in New Mexico. And in the early 1990s, those kids came forward and were getting absolutely no support. And I realized that my element of the story was important because I knew him first, and that was the incentive for me to come forward. With other victims, many of them, because of the emotional trauma they go through, they develop substance abuse problems, and it's not until they address the alcoholism or the drug abuse, get into therapy, get into treatment, that they get to the point where they feel that it's time to address the root of the problem.
Well, Phil Saviano, not an easy subject to talk about, but I want to thank you for coming on with us today.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
All right. We hope you'll stay with MSN.